Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 19. The Far East. From the opening of the Far East to Western trade and influence, largely at the insistence of American traders, China was the recipient of American favor and protection, while Japan was regarded with suspicion and rivalry. The culmination of this process was in World War II, when China was an ally and Japan was our enemy. In fact, as Pearl Harbor showed, American intervention in the war arose over its efforts to protect China from Japanese aggression. Yet, in the post-war period, this relationship was reversed. Japan now represents the greatest success, and China the greatest failure, of America's post-war foreign policy. Our policies are often praised or blamed for these discordant results, but they should not be, for it could easily be argued that we were hardly aware of what we were doing in either case, and the outcomes were the consequence of forces quite beyond our control. This almost certainly is correct in China, but the amazing success story that is to be seen in contemporary Japan may well be attributed to successful American policies, in combination with the peculiar social and personality patterns of the Japanese people. The Japanese Miracle. The word miracle has been applied to a number of post-war events, such as the economic upsurge in West Germany, but it is nowhere more applicable than in Japan. For Japan is the only major area outside Europe, except the United States itself, which has reached that stage in economic development which W. Rostow called takeoff. That is, it has reached a point in development where the process continues by its own momentum, accumulating and investing its own capital, with increasing production of food from a constantly dwindling farm population, a shift in diet from emphasis on energy foods to emphasis on protective foods, and a shift in industrial activity from products requiring unskilled labor in a low capital-to-labor ratio toward products requiring highly skilled labor in a high capital-to-labor ratio. The Soviet Union itself has not yet reached this point in development, so that Japan is now the only fully advanced industrial nation in Asia, and has, as a consequence, taken on characteristics that are familiar to us from Western European and American experience, but are totally unknown elsewhere in Asia, Latin America, or Africa. As a consequence, Japan is, for these still backward areas, a more helpful model of economic development than either the United States or Western Europe, since these two earlier examples of development did not have to face some of the problems, such as lack of resources and heavy population pressure on the land, which Japan was able to overcome. Thus, a Peace Corps of missionaries for development techniques would be more helpful from Japan than the present American Peace Corps of recently graduated college students, on the ground of technical experience, if not on the ground of humanitarian motivation. The key to the Japanese takeoff rests, as it must, on the relationship between population growth and food supply. Japan, whose population growth from 44 million in 1900 to 93 million in 1960 once made it a prime example of an overpopulated country, now has the demographic pattern of a Western industrial society. It has one of the world's lowest birth and death rates, and a life expectancy of 65 years for males and 70 for females, with an increasing percentage of older persons. The birth rate and death rate per 1,000 were both cut in half from 1946 to 1961, the former from 34.6 to 16.9, and the latter from 15.3 to 7.4. But 1963 Japan had the lowest death rate in the world, about 7 per 1,000. As a result of these factors, the population increase of Japan which was once over 1,700,000 a year, is now about 900,000 yearly, and in 1959 fell to 780,000. It is expected that Japan's population may reach a peak of about 107 million by 1990, and then begin to decrease, falling below 100 million again by 2010. This changing population picture in Japan owes nothing to the American military occupation and rests very largely on the strong, self-disciplined, inscrutable Japanese character. Of this, we know very little. There have been a number of studies of the Japanese personality, the best known of which, by Ruth Benedict and Geoffrey Gorer, are based on no real personal knowledge and on impressionistic evidence. The truth is that the Japanese personality seems to have an achieving pattern, but at present we know very little about it. At any rate, the Japanese solution of their population explosion rests very largely on aspects of their personality structure. Abortion plays a much greater role in their population control than would be acceptable to many persons in our Western culture. Unlike their population control, the recent Japanese success in producing food owes a great deal to the American occupation. This Japanese agrarian reform is one of the remarkable economic transformations of this century. With 650 persons per square mile, compared to 50 in the United States and 25 in the Soviet Union, Japan has only 2/10 of an acre of arable land per person, and most farms are merely gardens of less than 2 acres. By 1940, about 70% of Japanese farmers were paying rent for land and almost 30% were landless. Rents were high, and agrarian discontent became one of the chief pressures behind Japanese aggression in the 1930s. At that time, the land was extensively exploited in the Asiatic fashion, by applying large amounts of hand labor to it. Much of it was terraced. More than half of it was irrigated. There was intensive application of fertilizers, including human waste, and the chief emphasis was on energy-yielding food, mostly rice. The reorganization of Japanese agriculture was largely due to the American military occupation, SCAP, and was so successful that the index of agricultural production increased 40% in the decade 1951 to 1961. This revolution rested on 2 supports: the Agrarian Reform and technological advances. The Agrarian Reform redistributed the ownership of land by the government, taking all individual landholdings beyond 7.5 acres, all rented land over 2.5 acres, and the land of absentee owners. The former holders were paid for these lands with long-term bonds. In turn, peasants without land, or with less than the maximum permitted amount of 7.5 acres, were allowed to buy land from the state on a long-term, low-interest rate basis. Cash rents for land were also lowered. As a result of this program, Japan became a land of peasant owners, with about 90% of the cultivated soil worked by its owners. The peasants were helped in making the transfer because the earlier period of the occupation was one of food shortages, inflation, and an active black market with high prices. These profits also helped finance the beginnings of the new revolution in agricultural technology. This drastic change in farming methods in Japan was toward the American method of farm development, using less and less hand labor and greater amounts of capital, especially in farm machinery and fertilizers. Today, all kinds of power and mechanical equipment, such as threshers, pumps, lifts, sprayers, and such, are common in Japan. Most spectacular has been the spreading of hand tractors or power cultivators of 3 to 7 horsepower, something like American rototillers. These have increased from 7,000 in use in 1947 to 85,000 in 1955, and to almost 1 million in 1962. These can be used with special attachments as plows, cultivators, pumps, sprayers, saws, and draft vehicles, and have helped to eliminate draft farm animals and to reduce heavy human labor. Since a farmer can do as much work, especially plowing, with his piece of equipment in one day as used to require 10 days' work, using animal power, he has a longer growing season, can extend the practice of double cropping, and has much more time for other work. Two aspects of this agricultural revolution deserve special mention. Japan, like the United States, is now shifting its diet from energy foods like rice toward protective foods like meat, milk, fruit, and green vegetables. And Japan, also like the United States, has now broken free from the older alternative of either high output per acre or high output per unit of labor, and has now reached the stage where both are rising together. In the 10 years of this agricultural revolution, 1951 to 1961, rice production went up 30%, but dairy cattle increased 10 times, meat products about 3 times, fruit production almost doubled, and the number of persons engaged in farming has fallen rapidly, by better than 10%, or more than 1.5 million persons in the 5 years 1956 to 1961. As a result, the percentage of the working population engaged in farming is now about 28%, and has a steadily increasing portion of older persons and of females, as the younger males stream steadily to the city, seeking jobs in industry. Of course, this transformation in agriculture could never have occurred if there had not been taking place equally drastic changes in industry. These industrial changes, including a high rate of investment, rapid technological change, and excellent demand for industrial products, provided a plentiful supply of jobs and an increased demand for food and other agricultural products by city dwellers. These conditions acted like a magnet to attract a growing flood of farm products and energetic young peasants to the cities. The contrast between the structure and distribution of Japan's population and that of other Asiatic nations shows clearly that Japan is no longer a backward, underdeveloped, or colonial area from any point of view. The marks of such a backward society are usually a high birth rate and death rate, a largely young rural population, with the great majority in agriculture, and mostly illiterate. In Japan, all of these characteristics are untrue. Birth and death rates are very low. The population is aging rapidly, is almost totally literate, has below 29% in agriculture, and has over 60% resident in areas classified as urban. Moreover, the revolution in Japanese industrial development has shifted the country out of its previous colonial orientation in economic organization and commerce. Before the war, Japan lived by exporting labor, largely unskilled labor. It did this by importing raw materials, working them up by largely unskilled labor into products of light industry, chiefly textiles, and exporting these products for more raw materials and food. Today, the Japanese need for imported food is decreasing and is shifting away from its previous food needs, notably rice, to foods of more protective character, such as proteins. At the same time, its raw material imports are slowly shifting from those used in light industry, such as raw cotton, to those used in highly skilled industrial lines, such as electronics, where few other nations can compete. This inevitably means that Japan's trade has been shifting from Asia and other backward areas, where it exchanged cotton textiles for rice, to the United States and Europe, where it exchanges cameras, radios, tape recorders, and optical supplies for metals, manufactured goods, or materials for advanced industry. Its needs for petroleum, iron ore, and other bulk raw materials are tending to shift to colonial areas, so that its petroleum now comes from the Persian Gulf instead of the United States, and its iron ore comes increasingly from India. The social impact of economic changes such as these is far-reaching. The cities are growing rapidly, while many rural areas are losing population as their peoples flock to urban areas. By 1961, 44% of the total population was clustered in 1% of the country's total area. Tokyo, with 7 million people in 1940, was down to 3 million in 1945, and passed 10 million in 1961. Other cities grew steadily, but at a slower rate, and by the present day are agglomerating into 4 megalopolitan areas. Tens of millions of commuters swarm into these to work each day, and the traffic problem, especially in Tokyo, has become almost insoluble. As might be expected, such rapid material advance and profound social change has given rise to all kinds of social problems. Family discipline has weakened, and the older Japanese morality and outlooks are now widely rejected. Marxism and existentialism vie for the allegiance of the educated, while the less esoterically informed are satisfied with the pursuit of material success and personal pleasures. The gap between these two groups is considerable, and much of the stability, both political and social, in Japanese society today seems to rise from the self-satisfaction of the new middle class and the eagerness of many peasants and workers to get into that class and enjoy its benefits. These benefits increasingly provide a life like that in American suburbia, with television, baseball, bulldozers, picture windows, neon-lighted department stores, mass advertising, instant foods, and weekly slick magazines. The speed with which this has come about is almost beyond belief. Commercial television began in Japan in 1953. 5 years later, 16% of urban houses had a set, but by 1961, 72% had sets. Electric washing machines increased from 29% of urban houses in 1958 to 55% 3 years later. This salaried middle class is the key to the rapid achievement and political stability of Japan. Ambitious, hard-working, loyal, reliable, very adaptable to bureaucratic organization, scientific training, and rationalizing processes, they are suspicious of ideologies or extremist doctrines of any kind, and form one of the world's most amazing peoples. These general attitudes have given Japan the appearance of successful adaptation to democratic political life, as determined by the SCAP, imposed Constitution of 1947. As a matter of fact, the Japanese are basically uneasy about individualism, democracy, mass society, and the speed of their economic change. But few have much of an urge to rock the boat, and those old enough to remember the years of tension and war, from 1931 to 1944, have no preference for them. There are discontented groups, including the ultranationalists on the extreme right and the various socialist, communist, and student groups on the left. Both of these extremes, especially the former, operate in an atmosphere of considerable unreality. The really notable feature of Japanese political ideology is the way in which SCAP's Agrarian Reform has driven communism out of the rural areas and restricted it to the cities, chiefly to student groups. The foundations of the present political system in Japan were established by SCAP in the early years of the occupation. In the early months of peace, 5 million Japanese military were demobilized, and 3 million civilians were repatriated from overseas areas. When Japanese prisoners of war were eventually returned, about 375,000 in the hands of the Russians were never accounted for. More than 4,200 Japanese were convicted of war crimes, over 700 were executed, and about 2,500 were sentenced to life imprisonment. An additional 220,000 persons were permanently excluded from public life, and about 1,300 nationalist and extremist organizations were banned. The Shinto religion was separated from the state, forbidden to propagate militaristic or ultranationalist doctrines, and Emperor Hirohito was forced to issue a public statement denying that he was divine. A Japanese Bill of Rights protecting the rights of individuals and political freedoms on a much more extensive basis than we have in the United States, was issued in 1945. The centralized police control in the Home Ministry was abolished, and police powers were curbed. A new civil code established freedom from family domination for all and equality for females. The Constitution itself, issued by SCAP in 1946, provided that a prime minister be chosen by the 467 members of the House of Representatives, who themselves were chosen by universal adult suffrage. These were elected from 118 electoral constituencies, each represented by from 3 to 5 members, although the voter could cast his ballot for only one candidate. This ensured representation for minority views and made it difficult to obtain a majority in the House without coalitions of parties. However, the parties have tended to coalesce into two wings around the conservative Liberal Democrats and the Socialist Party. Except for the period April 1947 through October 1948, when the Socialists controlled the government during a period of extreme labor unrest and violence, control has been in the hands of the Liberal Democratic Party and its allied groups. These have generally won almost 2/3 of the seats in elections over the last 10 years, since 1955, while the Socialists have had difficulty in obtaining 1/3 of the seats. The chief difference between the two parliamentary groups revolve around foreign affairs, with the Liberal Democrats committed to a pro-Western policy in strong alliance with the United States and rather isolated from Asia. The Socialist group wishes to weaken the American connection and resume Japan's traditional position as a leading Asiatic power. The economic orientation of Japan and its booming prosperity have made the task of the Socialists a difficult one. The different views of the two parties in domestic politics are reflected in a controversy over the Constitution. This document, in Article 9, renounces war and forbids maintaining an army, navy, or air force. Despite this, in July 1950, General MacArthur ordered formation of a defense force, and the United States insisted on this at the time of the peace treaty with Japan the following year. The Mutual Defense Alliance with the United States, signed in March 1954, bound Japan to maintain a defense force of 275,000 men. Since this force is unconstitutional, the Socialists have sought vigorously to keep their parliamentary representation at over 1/3 of the seats, to prevent an amendment removing Article 9. All amendments require a 2/3 vote of the Parliament, plus a majority in a national referendum. However, even in 1963, when the Socialists made a desperate effort to obtain 1/3 of the seats, 156, they fell 12 seats short of the necessary number. They have received little help from the Communists, whose parliamentary representatives rose to a peak of 35 seats in the disturbed period 1949, but they alienated the Japanese by their addiction to violence and have elected only a handful of members since 1950, none in October 1952, following the May Day riots of that year, and only 3 in 1960, increased to 5 in 1963. On the whole, Japan in the 20th century has been an extraordinary country, and this characterization does not decrease with the passing years. It is a bulwark of strength to the Western Bloc, not because of its military power, which is insignificant, or even as an American military base in the Far East, but because it, like West Germany, is an example of the freedom and prosperity associated with being an American satellite, in sharp contrast with the unhappy plight of the Soviet satellite states. Above all, Japan for the neutrals and the backward areas of the world is a living proof that it is possible to advance from backwardness and slavery to prosperity and freedom.